Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. That's not me singing. Welcome back. This is the second public session of the symposium. Is photography over? Let me ask first of all, could you put your hand up if you were not here last night? Okay, interesting. All right, that's maybe like a quarter, I would say. A third, you think? Okay. So let me say a bit about where we're at here. So we had as obviously many of you know, we had a first session here last night, and tried to air some of the issues, some of the ways in which one might break down this rather kind of blunt question, is photography over, into some of its component parts, and begin to find out what aspects of this might have meaning or feel urgent to any of the representatives of the various communities of photography that we have here, not just here, but out here, very importantly. We had a session this morning just with the participants, and did some more work around some of these questions, and we'll say a little bit about to start with this afternoon about the state of those discussions. But for the most part this afternoon, we want to really open it up to everybody here and make this session, very much not just two-way, but always like just a large plenary session. And we have two microphones for those of you in the house. One is right there, and one is down the front here for you to comment and ask questions. My name's Dominic Willsdon, by the way. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs here, and I'm chairing this again with my colleague Erin O'Toole, who's Assistant Curator for Photography here, and the Curator of the exhibition View from Here, which is up on the third floor. And I'm going to ask Erin to introduce our speakers, largely for the benefit of those of you who weren't here last night.
Thank you. Let's see where to start. I can barely see them. Okay. We'll start at the far end. Over here to my left is Philip-Lorca diCorcia, also known as PL, who is a photographer whose work has been collected and exhibited by museums around the world. Most recently, he had monographic exhibitions at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston and at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. He also holds the position of Chief Critic at the Graduate School of Art at Yale, from which he received his MFA in 1979. Next to him is Peter Galassi. Nope, sorry, you're hiding back there, Blake. Okay. Sorry. Next to him is Blake Stimson, not to be confused with Peter Galassi, who teaches art history and critical theory at UC Davis. His book, The Pivot of the World, Photography and Its Nation, was published by MIT in 2006. And in 2008, he co-edited the anthology, The Meaning of Photography, for the Clark Art Institute and Yale University Press. So next to him is Peter Galassi, who has been the chief curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York since 1991. He's organized numerous exhibitions, the most recent of which is Henri Cartier-Bresson, The Modern Century, which is now on view at MoMA, and will travel here to SFMOMA in November of this year. Next to him is Vince Aletti, who is on this page. He was the former art editor and photography critic for The Village Voice, and now reviews photography exhibitions for The New Yorker and books for Photograph magazine. He also has experience in the curatorial realm. In 2009, he was co-curator of the International Center of Photography's Year in Fashion. Next to him is George Baker, who is a professor of art history at UCLA and an editor of the journal October. He's written many books and essays, including a forthcoming book to be entitled Lateness and Longing on the Afterlife of Photography. Next to him is Doug Nickel, who is currently the Andrea V. Rosenthal Professor of Modern Art at Brown, where he teaches the history of photography. He was a curator here at SFMOMA for 10 years, starting in 1993, and following that was the director of the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson. Next to him is Corey Keller, an associate curator of photography here at SFMOMA. She's organized exhibitions on both 19th century and contemporary subjects for the museum, and is currently organizing retrospective surveys of the work of Francesca Woodman and J.B. Green. Next to me is Charlotte Cotton, who is creative director for the proposed London space of the United Kingdom's National Media Museum. Previously, she was director of photographs at the Victoria and Albert, head of programming at the Photographers Gallery, and head of the Department of Photographs at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Next to her is Walead Beshty, who is an artist and writer. His most recent solo exhibitions were at the Thomas Dane Gallery in London and at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C. He's also an associate professor of fine art at the Art Center College of Design in Los Angeles. Next to him is Geoff Dyer, who's somewhere on here. He writes both fiction and nonfiction. His fourth novel, Geoff in Venice, Death in Varanasi, was published in 2009, and his nonfiction book on photography entitled The Ongoing Moment won the International Center of Photography's Infinity Award for writing on photography in 2006. Next to him is Trevor Paglen, who is an artist and geographer. He's written 4 books, exhibits his work internationally, and is a researcher at the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley. Next to him is Jennifer Blessing, who is a curator of photography at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. In 2009, she organized the exhibition Catherine Opie, American Photographer, and she was co-curator of the exhibition Haunted, Contemporary Photography, Video, and Performance, which is now on view at the Guggenheim. And last but not least is Joel Snyder, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago. He is co-editor of the journal Critical Inquiry and writes on photography, the history and theory of representation, and the history and theory of perspective and optics. Thank you.
So a couple of words about the type of event we've tried to put together here. We wanted to do an event that had a process, that had a conversation and moved through different stages, and that began by us commissioning short texts, 500-word texts from each of these participants that we published online in the last couple of months. We also commissioned a couple of additional texts from Tom Mitchell at the University of Chicago and Oakley and Wazel, to individuals that we were not able to attend, but we had invited originally. And then based on all those. And Sandy Phillips, of course, senior curator here. Also wrote a text that appeared on the blog Open Space with those other 2 just at the beginning of this week. And we've also invited 3 people to report on these sessions and make those posts again to the museum's blog Open Space. Sarah Miller, Brendan Fay, and Joshua Chuang. So you can find those texts on that blog. What we thought we'd do with this afternoon to start with is just us up here take 30 or 40 minutes or so to tell you about where we've got to in the state of these discussions, and then really open it up for the rest of the afternoon and see what it is that you want to talk about and pursue. One other thing to say is that one thing I've learned so far is we need to buy more of those chairs so that these 3 of us don't have to be elevated in this slightly strange manner. Let me begin with, we have about 3 or 4 topics that a lot of our discussions so far have circled around. And one of those is unsurprisingly perhaps to do with the advent of digitization. And we have a number of different perspectives on the panel here about how the digital in photography matters and also how it doesn't matter. So let me just ask anybody to start on that one.
Who wants to start?
Where's Peter Galassi? Okay, one way in which we sort of nuanced our question yesterday was to say not is photography dead, but if in but, over. Wow, there's actually a story in that which we'll get to. That people think we say dead. I just said it, but that's a question. But is photography over? But in photography, if there's something over, what is it and how does it matter? And this morning, Peter Galassi said that chemical photography is dead. And yet,
Now you have to deal with it.
The technology of photography has been changing since the invention of photography. The digital revolution is a major thing that's transforming every aspect of our life. And it is chemical photography is effectively dead. It'll be some kind of little niche activity that'll go on the sides of things, but basically photography henceforth will be digital. And to an enormous degree already is digital. The photography is also, it's a way of capturing a picture, the image that's made by a camera. It's also a lot of other things, including methods of transmission of these images, and of course the digital world is transforming those more radically than any other aspect of it. But in terms of fixing the image that is made inside a camera, the advent of digital photography, digital technology really didn't change photography very much. You can still capture the image that the camera makes. And in that sense, photography is very much alive, and digital technology is ensuring its future life.
So does anyone want to speak to sort of the other side of the coin, which is that there are ways where it has changed photography, this digital idea?
I think it's changed it. For most of my life, I subscribed to the better living through chemistry approach. And now that, that is challenged by too many dark rooms, I can barely see. I think that one of the great things about digital photography is that I don't know how to do it, and I ask everybody else to do it. So it's doubled. It's the fact that digital technology does a lot of things that you used to have to do yourself. And what you're not actually doing it, you're correcting what it does. And the fact that when most of the graduate students that are entering the photography marketplace get out, that's just about the only skill they have to sell. So I think it has a place, economic and otherwise. You don't want this, do you?
Pierre, can I just ask you a little bit more about that? Because this morning you said that that you talked about a quasi-crisis, and that was something to do with the fact that the digital had opened up a world of endless possibilities in which we were almost paralyzed, or we couldn't make a decision.
Well, that's the whatever the aphorism. If one thing matters, everything matters, or if one thing doesn't matter, nothing matters, or is it both? It seems to me that the proliferation of imagery is beyond anybody's imagination, and does that level everything, or does it create hierarchies within that are even more extreme than they used to be within the system of selection for like what is valid, what is good, and I think that in the art realm is a serious thing, because there is, and I think there's another thing we talked about. There is a hierarchical system for it within the curatorial world, which selects out things, and with so much more to select from, is there in the old school chemical world, the expertise, the willingness to deal with it.
I mean, I don't want to just bore the panel by restating or rephrasing something I said earlier, but I think from an educational perspective is when this sort of question of the digital sort of points out a kind of problem within the way photography has been taught, and that usually the technical is treated as the technical is often treated as separate or autonomous from the idea of photography being about picture making. And what you end up having with the move to digital is, aside from that kind of touch-based, sort of craft-based understanding and intelligence that develops from directly interfacing with the materials and the media itself, you have what develops is a kind of transparent or direct, an idea that digital is just a direct output, and that understanding what's at stake and what the resistance is and what the presence of that material really is inaccessible through the analogy to analog or photographic processes that are chemical based. And we got into this discussion about Photoshop being based on an analogy to digital chemical processes and curves and things like that, but in actuality that this is a kind of mask. And that at this point, there's not the same level of being able to interface with, well, what are the points of resistance? Because they've shifted. There aren't the same kinds of, the same kind of parameters that sort of develop with working with photographic prints and, chemicals, darkroom exposure. They're not the same. And the problem that comes up is developing a logic for, well, how to deal with the digital material, which is quite difficult when photographic practice is often taught as picture making, which leaves out that part of the question, I think.
Jenny, can I ask, there was something that kind of follows on from this you said this morning about a sort of a similarity between, we don't have to say crisis, but the moment of the digital and the moment of the shift to color that was to do with a perception of reality?
Yeah, I was just saying that I thought that there was it seemed like there's an anxiety expressed about the advent of digital and the question of truth to reality, and oftentimes people seem to worry that digital is somehow less truthful or more susceptible to manipulation than chemical photography was, which is not the case. In fact, throughout the history of photography, there has always been manipulation, whether it was in the darkroom or set up staged photography. So I think that is a false concern. But what I was saying this morning was that it reminded me of the kind of anxiety about color versus black and white photography in roughly mid-20th century, where there was a sense that black and white photography was more truthful to reality than color photography was, because color photography was associated with advertising, with spectacle, and it also, the color itself was not, seemed not to represent reality. And now we've kind of gone in the other direction. I gave the example of my kids looking at The Wizard of Oz. They see Oz as being more realistic than Kansas is, because Kansas is in black and white, and that looks fantastical to them. So that was just I think it's a misplaced anxiety if they...
And that actually linked to the second of the three kind of core topics that have concerned us so far, which was to do with a shift in belief systems or a shift in perception. And actually, Doug, you were speaking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're interrelated in a way. It seems that one of the stakes of the question being considered here, and in a way this follows from what Peter was saying, if our attention is focused exclusively on technology, does this new technology do something or not do something? Does it change something fundamentally? We're only paying attention to half of the equation of potential change. The way that photography works is that you have a system for making the image, you have the image, and then there's the way that we perceive the image as the third part of the chain. And I think we need to give greater consideration to that second half of the equation. Just to give a couple of examples to show how problematic this could be, what philosophers call thought experiments. Say Corey goes into the collection and pulls out a very detailed black and white gel and silver print, and we hire a very skilled artist, let's say a hypothetically extremely skilled artist, to make an exact rendering on glossy paper of this photograph, so well executed that from a distance it looks just like a photograph. We put these two objects under glass in frames, hang them on the wall, and invite anybody to walk in the doorway and look at these two objects and identify what they are. Most people would say two photographs. That's how we tend to react. Because as observers we take that handmade work to be a photograph, we bring to that transaction a set of expectations about how it was made and what its relationship is to something in the real world, and it's part of our cultural upbringing to regard a photograph as special in this way, having it's what is called an ontological relationship to its subject that is directly connected by way of chemicals, light waves, or light waves on digital surfaces, light registering surfaces, whatever it might be. But if you then get closer, or you give away the game, you tell your observer that this thing actually is a painting and not a photograph, then you have a different set of expectations that you're now bringing to exactly the same work. The work doesn't change, but the way we think about the work is going to change radically, knowing it has a different nature, a different way of coming into being. So I think that one of the difficulties that hangs over the larger question here is in an attempt to try to define what photography is, to decide whether that photography is over, we still haven't really come to a very rigorous definition of what a photograph is. It's not just cameras making pictures, it's also a set of expectations that we bring to looking at kinds of pictures that you could call photographic. And there's a very real possibility that that set of expectations is being radically mutated right now at this moment of history because of an understanding of, or what we believe happens digitally as something distinct from what happens analogically.
And Walead, you had an interesting observation about that, about sort of this idea of the photograph kind of disappearing because of this, of us growing accustomed to seeing things from that perspective.
Oh, well, it seems that one form of disappearance would be for a kind of lens-based image to become ubiquitous, and thus the lack of the ability, where we would lose the ability to compare it or contrast it, with another kind of image. I mean, that would be a form of disappearance in the sense that it would become so naturalized and so ever-present that there wouldn't be another form. Yeah, so that's the other side of this question of the presence or its being able to identify it as a specific discipline or practice or whatever it might be.
So there were a number of questions there around, I guess, the social conditions for the reception of photography and how that might have changed, and how, in what way different forms of photography could find their place today. The third topic of the three that we wanted to just present to set things up this afternoon was to do with what's sometimes spoken about as the two camps in art photography. That's to say, photographers and artists who use photography. And we had a discussion about what's the state of things with that that distinction. And George, do you want to say a couple of things about that?
Can I first slow us down just a moment and polemicize maybe a little bit? And I'm actually just maybe wanting to ask a question more than polemicizing, but I'm just wondering to the panelists and ultimately to the audience if people do find that we're rushing by this chemical history.
I was thinking we would just set out these three things, and then people can ask
Sure.
about any of these three or anything else.
Sure.
Just in like a few minutes.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask that. I mean, like, I guess my question really is there more of a loss here than we seem to be stating on the panel at the moment? Will people miss things? Are there experiences that won't be possible anymore if chemical photography is a vestigial niche little craft people can devote themselves to like a hobbyist, but has no purchase in the culture anymore? And this is a nostalgic question, maybe, and nostalgia is what it's about, but I am kind of wondering about what does pass away. Because I don't agree with Peter, I think, that photography is just about an image captured by the camera. I mean, we can't define photography, I think, on this panel, but I mean, obviously there are cameraless photographs. We all know about that. That's not what I'm talking about exactly. It's just about the stress on the optical, that the analog image somehow holds us back from just embracing that kind of image as photography itself and only. I think about Geoff Wall's essay, the short little essay, Photography and the Liquid Intelligence. That if we stress the optical, what we're forgetting is the liquids that were involved, and flow. And I think about Ronnie Horn's work in the present. I think about certain photographers who really are trying to articulate some other aspect of what was once possible in the medium. So I just wanted to ask about what, and if other people besides myself, I guess I'm a pathological nostalgic, feel that there is something that is being lost here that one wants to describe and stress the specificity of, or if there's a continuity of change in photography and we're just witnessing the latest transformation and should deal with it.
What do you think would be lost? I mean,
something about Walead used the word resistance, the resistance of the medium in the ways in which it was practiced in the past, resistance, materiality, physicality, but also connection. Yes, you could manipulate chemical photography, not as wildly, I think, as digital photography. You could do that, but there was that. I mean, we could stress other things, but always I come back to that physical connection to an object in the world that the image somehow carries along with it.
But the digital, I mean...
How can you say that? I mean, physical... I mean, if the average art photographer, photograph in a museum now fell on you, you probably wouldn't survive.
So true. So true.
You know, 30 years ago, you could take it home in your pocket and maybe get it out of the museum. I mean, I don't know what you mean by physical.
Yes, you do, PL. It's what you said last night about affect that I was referring to. It's about an attachment to an object in the world, often a loving one, a desiring one. It's not about how big or heavy the photograph has become. It's about its attachment to something.
Well, that was another thing that we weren't going to bring up, but we discussed. Where people apprehend a photograph has changed and varies enormously, and that has increasingly been in huge white spaces. And we didn't even go into books. So, it's changed quite a lot. Photography's absorption has, to some degree, been a very good thing for the practitioners, but just like all absorption, you get a little bit tainted by what you're absorbed by.
I just don't. I think that it's hard to identify what those resistances might be at this point. I think largely because it took quite a long time to figure out what on earth that was with regard to light-sensitive material or light-sensitive, silver, and how to use that and how to figure out what that meant, and that this wasn't going to. I brought up Oliver Wendell Holmes and saying no one's going to travel anymore because we're just going to look at stereographic views of far-off places, and then we'll actually have been there. It's just the same, And I think as time goes on, the configuration and the sort of resistances implicit within digital media will become more and more readily available. But at this point, there hasn't been that much time to play with it, and it's still a sort of, it still operates as a kind of simulation of an older technology. But I also think that photography is far more legible simply because at these moments of technological shift, the anachronism of certain aspects of it make it pronounce itself, in the same sense that if the ubiquitous lens-based images say we can't tell the difference between one and another, in some sense this process of something becoming outmoded also makes it more concrete, more understandable, and opens up a set of possibilities as well. So I just wonder, I also wonder what possibly could be. I mean, I don't know, like technologies come and go all the time, and certain kinds, the steam train left, but then people have really nice experiences on electrical-based trains, or whatever it might be. I mean, there's still this space for a romantic or a kind of romanticized or sort of, an affecting relationship between to objects and to things. And digital things have to become objects at some point. I mean, the computer screen is an object, is a materially concrete moment. You need to have a thing to look at this on. It's never going to just be, beaming images into people's heads. I mean, no matter how much we might wish or pretend that might be, or make sci-fi drawings of it, it's not going to happen. And I think that there's always going to be a material base, and there's always going to be something to touch and manipulate and push around. It's just our ability to talk about it and our ability to, and for those resistances to be understood, I think that's what's sort of slow. We're sort of in between,
Actually, Walead, Peter Norton, who probably knows a little bit more about digital technology than most of us, actually thinks it is going to happen.
Sure.
So I for sure don't know, but there are people who think it will.
What's going to happen?
That you will have virtual images appearing inside your head because you've got something planted in there that is producing them.
Then
And he will sell you the antivirus.
He sold that business.
I don't feel threatened about that moment coming.
And we already have, I think most of us, I confess, can't tell the difference often between a digital print on the wall and a gelatin silver print, as long as they're both really well done. There are really crappy digital prints, but there are beautiful and very finely crafted digital prints right now, so that I can't tell the difference. And I don't think in the end the result makes a lot of difference, as long as they're both artistically or well crafted.
I think with the passage of time, face-mounted or back-mounted photographs are going to have a nostalgic feel to them. They already do. And, these technologies, like 8 tracks, I guess at one point, an 8-track was, radical, and it quickly became an object of nostalgia. I think each of us has dedicated a significant part of our lives to something that is called photography, even if we don't really agree on what exactly photography is. And I think that we all still think that there's something to continue thinking about. I don't feel that there's a threat, or that that there's somehow any kind of that I would have a less passionate engagement, I guess, because we've entered a digital world. And so I guess the question is, what does the photograph, or what does photography mean, is one that we each have to answer. I think maybe I would say something about it being a means to bear witness. Last night, Peggy Fallon said to me, photographs are a consolation. They're a consolation. You could have been there, you weren't there, you can't be with someone anymore, but that's a power that they have. And I think even if it was a drawing that looked like a photograph, it still has the power, and that knowing that it's a drawing and not literally a photograph doesn't change the power for me. I think because it's about a certain kind of belief structure associated with photographic vision, even if it's not literally photographic.
I think I wanted to pick up on what Jenny said about possibilities, because I think, I feel a little guilty in the sense that we put this question out there and implied the possible death of photography, which of course we'd never meant to do. And I think what's so exciting actually about what is happening is the incredible range of possibilities. And what's frustrating for me is the sort of limits of our old models of thinking. And so we're at this moment where we have to sort of think about the models that we've been using to think about photography and what needs to change. So perhaps in ways some of those models are over, and how can we expand our thinking to accommodate what's shifted in photography? Then that's really what I hoped we might get at a little bit today.
What models do you think are over?
Xerox photography.
Well, I think, one of the things that we've talked about is like the place of, let's say, vernacular photography, for example, within the quote-unquote canon.
Mm-hmm.
I did a show about 19th century scientific photography here, and the thing I most had to defend to people was, why is this in an art museum? Which to me is a non-question.
Yeah.
But it still comes up. Or how do we deal with one of the things for me that's changed about digital photography is the way photographs circulate.
Well, why was it in an art museum? That would be a question I'd ask.
Because, well, first of all, where else would it be?
Natural History Museum?
Science museum?
Yeah, it could be. But why does it? Well, because first of all, the idea that these photographs, that the aesthetics of the photographs were, an afterthought, is not historically correct. Because certainly, when you make a picture, instead of a document or data, that are numbers, you have to think about it like a picture. And therefore, it feeds into all kinds of other visual systems about how you look at other pictures. So the people who are looking at scientific pictures are also looking at all kinds of other pictures and bringing their habits of viewing to those pictures as well. So it's worth considering within those networks.
So why do we have such difficulties applying that to contemporary art photography? If you're going to say in the 90s, they're all dead, the 19th century astronomers and scientists who made those fabulous photographs, so we have this license to think of them in the context of a modern art museum for their formal values, or to say, well, at that point in history, innovation, one of the places where true photographic innovation happened was within science. Mm-hmm. Why do we have such difficulty embracing the fact that digital isn't really inherently about contemporary art photography? It's about a massive and profound social change. And that it's not just about how artists respond to that, that's how we as viewers or us as curators respond to that as well.
I don't have any problem with that.
So we're policing the boundaries of art more strictly in the present than we are in the past.
Well, I've just recently sort of liberated myself from that being my worry, and it does seem like
because you're in a science museum.
Exactly, and really enjoying that lack of anxiety about what it is and what it isn't, and definitely whether it's art or not. It's an investigation. It's a photographic investigation within that context.
So I'm gonna open it up to questions now, but just there was one fourth topic which we said we wouldn't put out there, but I'm gonna say it just briefly, just in case you want to ask us about it, which is about institutions. I think many people up here felt that this would be too much talking shop, too much like a plumber's convention, Blake Stimson said. But if there are some questions of power and of the location of different forms and of genres of photography in the world today, how they get, and including in the education system, how photography gets taught, how it doesn't get taught, and then where photographers and photographs find themselves in art museums. But if you want to ask about that, then that's great. But we didn't want to make you talk about that. So I'm just going to ask, pardon? Yeah.
You said because we fear you.
Yeah. So let me just invite questions in. Pardon? Yes, and there are two microphones that we'd like you to go to. One is there and one is there.
We're simulcasting to another room, and the folks in the other room can't hear unless you go to the microphone, so I'm sorry about that.
It's also tricky in this room, I think, as we found last night, amplification. So if you want to just make your way to those microphones and line up if you like, that's great.
We can't pass the microphones to people?
No.
Go ahead.
This question, I wrote it down to try and make it fast, but then I kept adding things to it, and now it's illegible.
Welcome
I'll
to the
try
club.
this. Pardon me? If the wonder of photography was its instant credibility in the past and not so much now, what is it about the past that demanded we believe, and what is it about the present that demands we have a canvas to project our disbelief and our creative manipulation? And is the miraculous that Doug Nichols spoke about yesterday reframed in the referred to in the present, still, does that still exist, but in a different incarnation? 1 second. Blah, blah, blah. That was the most interesting part of the question. But I've decided to let you figure it out. I promise there's just one. I guess my question is what we're missing, is the reason we're asking, is it over now? Because we're surprised that the miracle still exists.
Does anyone want to respond to that? Anyone want to try?
I don't know. I've seen things on the internet that look pretty miraculous.
I'm not saying that the miracle is over. I'm saying it does still exist. And are we asking because we're surprised that digital photography can deliver that miracle? And is the miracle about something else? And is photography essentially about a miracle because it is this practice that comes in the instant? Despite all the manipulation, despite all the setup, the viewer's perspective is that here it is. And we still have that. And perhaps that's what's essential to photography. And who knows what will happen as it evolves into something 50 years from now that is no longer called digital.
I would suggest again that this isn't a technical issue or an aesthetic issue at all, but a larger cultural and social issue going on. The first part of your question, I think, is best answered by pointing out that it isn't the advent of Photoshop that changes the credibility of news photography, for instance, but rather an erosion of faith in the media that's happened in the past couple of decades, where, I mean, you could question why we ever believed that those institutions were using photography in an honest way. But we don't believe it quite as much as we used to. But because we don't believe journalism in general as much as we used to. That's not a specifically photographic or technical issue.
It also seems like there's always the naive character that's invoked to say, well, people believe the media. I mean, not me, but there are people out there who believe this stuff or take photography as being truth, or it's always, or before, right, when it was an unproblematic relationship to the real. So it's always somewhere else, someone else, someplace else, but never the people in the room.
Yeah, but forget about the truth or believing the media or anything. The digital technology has actually made the pictures in the New York Times, for example, much more interesting than they were 15 years ago. I mean, there's regularly absolutely fabulous, magical pictures. I'm not talking about are they true or not, what political point of view they represent. I'm just talking about amazing things to look at, 2 or 3 times a week in the New York Times. It's an incredible, and of course the reason is that the picture editors have instant access to a vastly greater resource of pictures that's just streaming by them all the time. So they can, rather than the New York Times has one guy in all of Asia or something like that. So the technology making the pictures available delivers to us kind of amazing pictures, that much more amazing than there were 20 years ago in the New York Times.
I guess I understood the question to be a little more general, not so much about news pictures or the media, but about what photography can do. And for me, that doesn't have anything to do with the technology, but with the vision behind the camera. The person who's looking, the person who's taking the picture, that's not going to change. I mean, it doesn't matter whether he's using a digital camera or any other old technology or something in the future. If he has, or he or she has a vision, that's what you're going to get. I mean, it's the eye behind the camera. And if that remains miraculous, if the passion or the excitement is there.
Just to add to Doug's point about this being a larger social and cultural issue, which I took the question to be addressing, is, certainly it seems fair to associate photography with the 19th century, to associate it with the idea of, democratic institutions, with the public sphere, with the exercise of reason, all these great, noble, modern ideals. And in a way, it was the single best cultural expression, perhaps, of those ideals. As a counterpoint to that, we might take as one expression of our contemporary lower level of belief in journalism and in photography and so on, the great statement by the Bush administration spokesperson who told a New York Times reporter that we in the Bush administration no longer believe in or work with the quote-unquote reality-based community, right? This thing. And of course, photography is really a vehicle or is an expression of that ideal of the reality-based community, and to some degree we can think of it as being archaic.
But it's also the creation of the photo op. I mean, sure. Which is the non-reality-based community.
I got the impression that people were initially amazed by this kind of magic trick that photography was, which was unreal. It was black and white, by the way, we'll get into that. And now it seems that it's flipped, and when it's real, people are amazed. And that's where the New York Times comes in. I mean, the impact of those images is most often, whether it's a potent reminder of the rest of the world or not, a reminder of things that all the other images in our lives make us inured to. And I think it is strange because the trick of photography, and it is a trick, and it always was a trick, and you can call it a chemical trick or a digital trick or whatever, has ceased to fascinate. So it's become a means of conveying information, emotion, the personality of the maker, a lot of different things. But it seems to me that apropos to what we've been talking about, the thing that seems to be most surprising now is when it does exactly what people thought it did a long time ago, and that is to show you something you didn't know. And that's rare. But I think that is kind of enhanced by the digital world. It's enhanced and cobbled by the digital world.
Geoff, did you have something you want to say?
Yeah, it strikes me that there's some special appeal in these sort of lost processes, now that everything can be done with such facility with all this technology, the less sophisticated technologies gain something. So of course the most extreme example of this is this guy who's got a show coming up soon in New York at the ICP, Miroslav Tiki, who I'm sure you know all about, who in the 1970s, I guess, he kind of built his own cameras, and he even built a kind of telephoto lens out of a kind of old baked bean tin. So this is really, and he referred to himself as a Stone Age photographer. And of course, because he built his own cameras with all of this sort of stuff, I mean, the light is never right, the framing's not right, and a lot of them are not in focus. But once he'd built this kind of crappy old camera of his, he just spent all his time just perving around the local pool, photographing women in bikinis. And the thing is that these photographs have an incredible kind of power and specialness partly because you feel his kind of loneliness very much, but they have a power that, I mean, these photographs on digitally, they would just be nothing. So it's actually all the defects of them which give them their kind of poignancy and beauty. And really, you do have there there's something absolutely miraculous about this most mechanical of approaches to photography. And I'm pretty sure that there's a show coming up at the ICP soon.
It's there right now.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's on there now.
I think we should take another question, Gary.
Hi.
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. I couldn't.
You can go with him next, but
okay. Okay. Gary.
It seems to me this panel's really taken to heart the museum's theme for its 75th anniversary, which is 75 years looking forward. Everyone has been very forward-looking. I was really intrigued by two comments from Joel Snyder last night that seemed to fall flat and didn't get a response. So I maybe would like to reframe them because they were very provoking for me. And I'll say from the perspective, I'm someone in my late 40s who came to photography, grew up in New York, came to photography through the history with a capital T as told by MoMA in New York. And that period reached its pinnacle probably in the late 80s when they had all the shows of the 150th anniversary of the birth of photography, where we got to see a canon or the canon and a story was told. And then what seems to me has happened the last 25 years, we've spent our energy destroying that canon, deconstructing that canon. So Joel said last night, when he goes and lectures to young artists or photographers, sometimes they know nothing about the history of photography. That doesn't surprise me because anyone under 35 has probably never seen a critical survey of photography on the walls of an institution. The second
How often
part.
are you in New York?
There's not
You
been.
should come look and see what's on our walls, because what you just
No,
said
you-
is completely
No, you
wrong.
specifically say in your shows that you don't use that approach. You use a thematic approach to do various topics. That's what you do in your current installations. Now, the second part has to do with his comments on
It's
cruel
not
intent.
true. You can interpret anything you want, but it's not true.
The second part has to do with Kroll and Tender, and which he raised the comment. And it seems to me that was 15 years after those other shows came back and said, we've got to find some way to tether contemporary practice to what was going on in the past. And what was interesting to me was you gave the perspective that it started with August Sander. It didn't. It started with Thomas Roof. And they had a pathway that was pretty much prescribed how they wanted you to go. If you wanted to get to from Sander to Evans, you couldn't follow the path they said. You had to go first through the Beschers and then to Evans. And it was because it was too threatening, I felt, in that show to say that this stuff in the past, it was accepted, the contemporary practice, but not the past. So what I'm wondering is there a possibility now, 25 years since we've had these big in-depth survey shows trying to establish a canon, could one be done again to try to say what's happened the last 25 years and maybe introduce a new generation to what is the history of the photography, a la what MoMA does with their paintings department, have a more messy history of modernism.
Those shows are over.
I don't know what to say. I mean, since 1964, the principal function of which is when photography had its own galleries, the principal function of those galleries has been to tell a history of photography, not the history of photography, from the collection. That expanded when we expanded in 1984, and it expanded again considerably when we expanded in 2004. And basically, together with this great institution and its great photography collection and traditions, we're one of only a handful, I mean, like 3 institutions in the world that take on this responsibility of laying out a history of photography in our galleries on a more or less permanent basis. The pictures change, the function doesn't. And so that's why I mean, you can say you don't like it, they're the wrong pictures, all the rest of that, but the function is there.
Okay, down here.
Yeah.
Does this one work? Can
Yeah.
people hear me? Okay. So what I wanted to do was make a few observations about what I perceive as your questions, the anxieties that your questions stem from, and then maybe that will stimulate some further questions from you or comments. It seems to me that the source of a lot of your three major topics here, plus a few that surfaced last night about the proliferation of images and whether it would still be possible for photography to exist under those circumstances, all of these concerns stem from something that has afflicted photography from its beginning, which is the fear that the man or woman behind the machine was merely a handmaiden or a servant or, utterly subservient to that machine, and that the machine was doing the work. And something Vince said about it's the eye behind the machine, and various other people on this panel have picked up the theme that really it's the person behind the machine that is making photography either an art or, let's say, a piece of science that will still be of interest in 100 years. I mean, this distinction between art and non-art is meaningless. We look at ancient pots that were made for other purposes and we look at them as art. So let's forget about that distinction, because in 100 years it's going to disappear, and only the photographs that are worth looking at for the reasons we now look at photographs are going to be around anyway. But also the anxiety that all of this is out there all the time and is going to somehow cheapen the process. If you just think about the analogy with words and what writers do and what editors do, words are out there all the time. Everyone's speaking in prose all the time, as Molière said, and that doesn't prevent the individual writer from selecting from that pre-existing pool the things that he or she wants to say. Editors even more so, and they are even more comparable to photographers because they are dealing with a given. They don't necessarily or shouldn't change too much what they're dealing with. They just arrange, they put in context, they select, they frame, crop, blah, blah, blah. You can see the analogies. So I think that it's quite possible for photographers dealing with this proliferation and this everyone has it, what am I doing, to rely on the fact that it is the individual behind the machine that's doing the work that makes the stuff valuable. Now, as far as the issue of loss, of course there are going to be losses. There are losses in the world of words, too. We don't have too many people writing plays in iambic pentameter anymore, but that's not too much of a loss. The loss is that we don't have Shakespeare, see? It's not the iambic pentameter that's the real loss.
Does anyone want to respond to that, or should I take another question? Okay. Yep, Corey.
I was just thinking that maybe one analogy, we tried to think a little bit before, what would be other comparable things. And one thing, if you want to take an analogy that we've lost, is the art of letter writing. I mean, in putting together our anniversary show, we went through the museum's archives and were amazed to find all of our directors' letters about how she felt about works of art that she'd bought for the museum, and explaining to people why art was so important. And we included that in the show. And we realized how much of our own correspondence had been either, two-word increments or had been just completely discarded. And I think that actually, in a way, I was talking to someone this morning about photographs. I think the snapshot and the digital, what's happened to digital photographs, the way we look at them, the way we consume them, the way we throw them out. My husband's iPhone crashed yesterday. We just lost all his pictures, and it was just like we had this moment where it was just it's terrible. And then we said, we'll take some more, But you had this sort of the snapshot as a physical thing. I think that goes back a little bit to the miraculousness we were talking about before, and how you can still find them, and what that moment of discovery, that sort of trouvaille, this amazing moment when you find that picture, and that's been lost, I think, to a certain extent. And it did remind me a little bit of what's happened to the way we speak to one another, which I also think has been lost.